White House plans to slash FDA and NIH, risk decimating two agencies at the core of U.S. biomedical innovation. We continue our look at Trump 2.0's impact on biopharma on the BioCentury This Week podcast. And we'll take a look at how biotechs are making inroads to precision medicine. I'm Jeff Cranmer, one of the executive editors here at BioCentury, and joining me to discuss all of this are my colleagues
Simona Fishburne, editor-in-chief,
Selena Koch, executive editor,
and Steve Austin, Washington editor.
And if you like what you hear today, don't forget to like the pod and subscribe and check out our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show. Okay, Steve, late last week you had a story that got a lot of attention out there in the internetosphere media complex. A draft order out of the White House that says there are plans afoot to cut FDA's staff in half, cut back at NIH, eliminate CDC. You've had your ear to the ground. I'm sure you've heard more over the weekend. Bring us up to speed.
What I was told is that that an executive order had been drafted, as you say, that would have had dramatic cuts at FDA, as much as 50% cutbacks. It would impose big cutbacks at NIH, and it would do to CDC what's already been done to USAID. There's been a huge backlash, including from the pharmaceutical industry, which has warned the White House that large-scale personnel cutbacks at FDA would bring reviews to a halt. And I think ultimately it's not likely to happen. At least it's not likely to happen the way that the people who had drafted that executive order and were trying to get the president's ear are going to, had hoped was going to happen. But there's a great deal of fear at the agency, at FDA, that some cuts targeted at FDA could happen, and that the policies that are being imposed on the entire federal workforce could lead to a lot of departures. Those policies include back-to-work policies. FDA supervisory staff are being ordered to report to the office 5 days a week starting February 24th, and all staff are being told that they have to be in the office by March 17. We've talked about this on the podcast before. There really isn't even space for all of those people, and very liberal telework policies have been in place at FDA for more than 20 years. They were put in place under Republican administration. And if they're actually imposed in a very heavy-handed way, it's going to lead to a lot of people leaving. Like a lot of the controversial things the Trump administration is doing or attempting, this one's going to be challenged in the courts. If the administration prevails and if there are no exceptions made for FDA staff who have built their lives on the assumption that they can work from home at least a few days a week, I think a lot of people are going to leave. The administration's also drawing up lists of staff who are working on a probationary basis. Usually that means for a year or less, who could be terminated quickly. It would be extremely disruptive if they do this at FDA, especially if the hiring freeze remains in place. I've been told that losing more than 10% of the review staff or a substantial number of inspectors could cause the agency to fail to be able to meet PDUFA goals and honestly to protect the public health. It's possible, I think, that litigation is going to slow the whole thing down. And if it does, then the big question is going to be, what does Marty Makary do? He's likely to be the next FDA commissioner. Presumably, he doesn't want to lead a sinking ship. So there's a world in which you can envision all of this gets slowed down by litigation. Marty Makary comes in, and it all kind of gets calmed down a lot. And some of the really bad things that people are envisioning don't quite happen.
Steve, I'm going to come back to FDA in a minute, but you glossed over NIH, which was also caught up in this. Can you talk a little bit about, I have not heard that industry is stepping in to protect NIH, although I have written and we've had a guest commentary talking about that. Where's NIH in this staff reduction whole scenario?
I think we're just at the beginning of the story for NIH. So the beginning of the story now is that the Trump administration announced that starting immediately, it's changing the funding formula for NIH grants. Indirect costs, which include things like facilities, maintaining equipment, administrative costs, et cetera, are going to be cut from an average of about 30% to 15% across the board. If this were to happen right away, the impact would be disastrous, especially for state schools like the universities of Michigan and Wisconsin, that don't have the kind of endowments that elite private institutions have. Again, lawsuits have already been filed. 22 attorneys general filed this lawsuit today. Universities are going to sue. I think that there's a good chance that they're going to prevail. That doesn't mean that it's the end of the story. If they do prevail, it's going to be because the Trump administration has overstepped its prerogatives that Congress reserves for itself the ability to change the indirect cost formula. It's possible, I would say even probable, that they would do that going forward. Probably, hopefully, they'll do it in a more tempered and rational way. I think anybody who looks at it rationally would say, yeah, there's really a lot of scope to change the way that indirect costs are allocated. And, we've written about that in BioCentury going back almost 20 years. But it also raises the bigger question of what happens to NIH in the long term. In the Trump's first administration, he proposed deep cuts, billions of dollars a year in NIH's budget. Congress just shrugged those off. Republicans and Democrats alike were united in saying that generous funding for NIH was essential, and they rejected Trump's attempts to reduce NIH's budget, to close, for example, the Fogarty Center, which handles global health issues and other things. I'm not so sure that's going to happen the same way this time. I think there's a lot less support. The support in Congress for NIH is not as solid as it was in the past. That's coming out of the pandemic. And there's also a lot more unanimity among Republicans around President Trump, a lot more reluctance to defy him. So I think we're just seeing the beginning of the story at NIH. We're also going to see, presumably, Jay Bhattacharya is going to be confirmed as NIH director, and it's quite likely that he's going to want to do dramatic things and to be seen to be doing dramatic things quite quickly. So I think we're going to see a lot happening there. The real question is, you touched on, well, what is industry going to say about it? What is industry going to do about it? It's interesting. I dug up some of my stories from the first Trump administration. At that time, somebody from the Biotech Innovation Organization, Bio, testified to Congress and said that the kinds of cuts that were envisioned for NIH would be disastrous for the biotech industry and strongly opposed them. I'm not sure whether industry would do the same here. I think what I'm hearing from CEOs is a reluctance to engage on issues that they don't see as being really core to their business interests, a desire to find ways to
Short-term business
accommodate
interests.
the Trump administration. Go ahead.
There's short-term business interests, let's stipulate. You're talking about biotech CEOs who might think that, that kind of funding doesn't affect their chance to get to a clinical trial and so on. Long-term, many of them actually have ties with academic groups.
Well, of course, the whole industry is predicated on advances of science that are funded by NIH and other.
But wait a minute. It's not just that. I mean, we've done stories on this. It's not only that they license a technology and then wave goodbye. Many, many biotechs and almost every pharma have deep, ongoing collaborations with academic labs.
Of course.
Yeah.
So the question is when they will decide that the threats to NIH funding are serious enough that they have to weigh in on them, and also whether they can sit on the sidelines and expect that others are going to do that for them.
Right.
Because, traditionally, Congress has been very enthusiastic about NIH funding. Virtually every member of Congress has got an NIH-funded institution in their district. And, it may be that industry thinks, well, this is really important, but it's not the place for them to spend their political capital. They've got to reserve it for the things that they think are the most impactful to them and that nobody else is going to come to their aid on. Personally, I think that that's a short-sighted approach, because I think that the Trump administration and Congress is going to be much more receptive to arguments from industry than they are from academic institutions. There seems to be a lot of antipathy in certain political quarters toward academic institutions now. And I think that this is the time when industry has to think about whether they have to be speaking up for these institutions and putting some of their political capital behind preserving basic biomedical research in the United States.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I wrote that, but I actually want to ask another question, Steve. FDA and also regarding FDA and NIH regarding DEI. So moving away from the issue of DEI in hiring, one thing that has come up in my conversations with people that they're not really clear about is to what degree the actual nature of research or clinical trials might be caught up in this. We know that, for example, you have to show a certain level of diversity in clinical trial recruitment. How do you think that, will that be spared, this DI lens?
We
What are you
don't
thinking
know.
about?
There's a great deal of uncertainty. There already have been grants that have been canceled. For example, grants that were looking at gender and racial equity issues in clinical trial recruitment. Some of those grants have been cut already. The draft guidance that FDA had on its website for clinical trials diversity has been removed. When RFK Jr. was asked about that in the confirmation hearing, was asked whether he would put it back and whether FDA would enforce the law, which requires them to provide guidance on clinical trials diversity. He said he would. It remains to be seen how that's going to play out. I think there's a great deal of concern.
But couldn't you then argue that maybe you can come with all China trials, all China patient trials, if we're not looking at diversity anymore?
That's an interesting theory. I wouldn't put any money behind it. If I were a VC or a company, I don't think I'd put any money behind that idea.
And Steve, in addition to just guidance is disappearing, we've also seen initiatives like Project Silver, which was launched during the first Trump administration to increase participation by senior citizens in clinical trials. Project Community has also disappeared. What's the impact of that?
It's been 2 weeks. To be fair, we don't know. One of the impacts is that there are people who were working at FDA who were hired to run some of these programs who are on administrative leave and expect to be fired. So that's a clear impact of it. How it's going to play out in the long run, we really don't know. What I do know is that there's a tremendous amount of fear and anxiety at FDA among the staff. And it's important to have morale. I don't see how you're going to have smooth functioning reviews, creative thinking, or if the hiring freeze is lifted, how you're going to recruit people to come to an agency where people are as afraid and concerned about their future and about the ability of their agency to conduct its basic mission as FDA is. So that's a real issue. What's going to really happen with those programs? Again, nobody really knows. It's possible that Marty Makary will come in and kind of right the ship and sort out the things that are clearly against administration policy from those things that are actually make a great deal of sense in terms of science and medicine. We really don't know.
Hey, Steve. So there are, of course, these like hot button issues like DEI, and then there's the hiring freeze. But when it comes to FDA's everyday operations bread and butter, I know there's people in industry that have been working with the agency to try and, execute their wish lists of regulatory innovation, maybe getting surrogate markers accepted, maybe getting trial starts made a little bit easier, this or that. And FDA has its own objectives for innovation and pilot projects and new guidances. Are we feeling like that stuff is going to be on pause for a minute while everything else goes on?
Pause. It's definitely all of that is on pause until there's a new commissioner. And that's not unusual. Even if the transition wasn't as turbulent as this one is, those kinds of initiatives tend to be put on pause, and then they're presented to the new commissioner, and people at the agency find out what the new commissioner's priorities are, what they want to emphasize, what they want to de-emphasize, things like that. So it's all a lot of it's in the same boat of uncertainty. What's going to happen with that? I wrote something in November, I think, saying that there's opportunity in chaos. There are initiatives like that could move forward in this administration. And it's possible that there are things that make a great deal of sense that everybody would agree are positive changes, or a lot of people would agree are positive changes. They could be kind of dressed up as being disruptive change that the administration wants to be seen as doing, and they could really move things forward. It's really too early to know, but the early signs are really alarming, and they're really alarming to people who are in the agency. I think they're really alarming to people in industry who depend on the agency being stable and predictable.
And you can find a guest commentary on this topic on our website, biocentury.com. It's by Luke Evnin, Peter Rubin, and Peter Kolchinsky, and that is in front of our paywall. I'll drop a link in the show notes. It's a call to action to stand up for NIH and the national Science Foundation. And at the bottom of the piece, you can find a link to sign on to their letter. Okay, well, coming up next month in Singapore, we have the BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit. We'll take a quick break so you can hear about that, and then we'll be back to discuss precision medicine.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit in Singapore. This March, BioCentury Bay Helix and Insights partner McKinsey & Company returned to Singapore for the 4th East-West Biopharma Summit. This year's theme, how to globalize Asia innovation from cross-border deals to the new co-model. Meet key players from across Asia's emerging arc of innovation, including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and Southeast Asia. Don't wait, deals are closing every week. Register today at biocenturyeastwest.com.
And speaking of the East-West Summit, we will have a special edition of our podcast late this week, where we'll have a few special guests to discuss the topics that we'll be exploring at the East-West Summit. NewCos, we've been talking a bit about it, the NewCo model out of Asia and Asia's arc of innovation. Let's turn to precision medicine. Selena, you took a look at the inroads biotechs are making in the space. What did you find?
Yeah, well, when we were analyzing recent FDA approvals for a story back in January, we noticed that precision medicine approvals had increased. So we looked into that a little bit further and found that last year, about 19% of all new drug approvals, so these aren't indication expansions, but new drugs, were precision medicines, biggest percentage probably ever. And what's more surprising about that is most of them are not from large pharmas, which we defined as just having a market cap over 50 billion for this analysis. Of the last 3 years, there were 23 precision medicines approved, of which 16 were from small and mid-sized companies. And that's kind of remarkable because for so long, people have been saying, grumbling, complaining, whatever, saying it's just too hard for small and mid-sized companies to not only, do what they need to do to get their first product developed, but at the same time, navigate the complexities of biomarker development, companion diagnostic development. And so it's kind of like a no-go zone for many of them. And approvals are, of course, a lagging indicator, but they are showing that some small and mid-sized companies are, in fact, able to do this. So it's a positive sign, I would say.
So, Selena, we do know, we often hear from biotechs that it's so difficult for them to engage with precision medicine for various reasons, although I think in cancer and in rare diseases in cancer, it's more common. I know that you'd spoken to executives from Servier and from Day One biotech companies. Can you talk about what they said to you and how they view this?
Yeah, I don't think it will surprise anyone, to know that we found most of these precision medicine approvals are in cancer, and there are driver genes, right? So cancer offers this great opportunity because you have these genes that are mutated and clearly driving the disease. And so the target of your medicine and the biomarker you need to develop to find your patients are like directly related to each other. And even if it's not perfectly direct, it's pretty darn close. And so you have these kind of patient populations that are not massive, right? So they're like the right size for small and mid-sized companies, and very tight rationale for a biomarker and a target. And so this has been the sweet spot. It will continue to be the sweet spot for the foreseeable future. That was the case with both of the two companies you mentioned, Servier and Day One. In addition to that, I think something Day One had going for it with being a young, small company picking its first indication, its first product. It's not just the size of the market it picked, but the fact that the biomarker that you need to find the patients is already part of a lot of standard sequencing panels. And it's a pediatric population where sequencing is done, right? So one of the challenges, right, is that it's still hard to get physicians, particularly outside of major academic institutions, to test for biomarkers. So if you have the right combination of size, type of biomarker, whether or not testing is done, you can move forward as a small company, but there are plenty of challenges still remaining.
And talk a little bit about your view on this outside of oncology.
Yeah, I mean, so in the neurology space, I think there's a lot of cause for optimism as the genetics of cancer are more, they've been understood for longer. Neuroscience is still lagging behind, but neurodegeneration in particular is an area where there are driver genes. They map to small subsets of patient populations, but they're there. You can find them. Companies know about them, and they are now going after them. So we're seeing companies targeting GBA1 mutant Parkinson's, progranulin mutant frontotemporal dementia, UNC13 mutant ALS, or FUS mutant ALS,
sorry,
so on and so forth. Yeah.
These are small companies. These are biotechs rather than pharmas.
And so we are seeing small companies leading the way here. There have been a few deals, like Eli Lilly has done a deal in that space. But for the most part, for now, the smaller companies are leading the way, and we will see if they take it all away or not.
Well, I think neuro is going to be a really interesting space to watch in that way. If small companies are the ones that are actually pushing forward in that way, and it'll be interesting to see if by going after these smaller populations that are biomarker driven, I think one of the ideas is that you then unlock the biology a bit more. You're kind of chipping away at these very large diseases, but you go after something where it's better defined. We talked a little bit before we talked a lot about the interface between research and drug development. And I think this is one of the areas, and we'll talk about this also at our Grand Rounds conferences, these sort of areas where you have biology and, pushing forward drug development and critical issues that get solved at that interface. So it is interesting that there's a lot of innovation happening, but also that it's small companies that are ready to take on some of those precision medicine challenges.
Yeah, and the larger disease of Alzheimer's, there you see the big pharmas are kind of the big drivers, and they talk about what they're doing there as precision medicine. It's just a little different than how we define it, because these days Alzheimer's has come to be defined as having amyloid. So the fact you're measuring the target, the biomarker, doesn't specify a smaller subset. But even there's some move toward more precision, particularly looking at levels of tau in the population and homing in on those who are, in that sweet spot in terms of disease progression, like not having too much tau to gain benefit from these kind of targets that act early in the disease biology. So that's another way people talk about precision medicine and neuro. People are also talking a lot about psychiatry and precision medicine, but that's just a very different beast. It's very far away from this driver gene framework that's been established and is working very well in cancer. So, the road there is just going to be a longer one.
All righty. And Simone mentioned Grand Rounds there. That's BioCentury's R&D conference at the Academia Industry Interface. Two this year, the second Grand Rounds in the U.S., June 4th through 6th in the city of Big Shoulders, Chicago, Illinois. And then we'll head over to Cambridge in the UK in September for Grand Rounds debut in Europe. You can learn more about that under the events tab on our website. And also on biocentury.com, the radiopharma landscape takes shape in neuroendocrine tumors. Our very own Karen Tkach-Tusman takes a deep dive here. And Steve, you spoke with Vic Bajaj of Foresight on our sister podcast, the BioCentury Show. What did y'all talk about?
We talked about AI, machine learning, and predictive biology. He gave really kind of like a little masterclass on overview of where he sees AI and machine learning now in the life sciences. And he weighed in on the controversy over whether it's going to be more productive to have AI machine learning integrated with drug development or developed separately as tools for the industry. He came down very much, probably unsurprisingly, on the side of saying that AI and machine learning need to be integrated iteratively with product development. I say it's unsurprising because he helped to fund and found Zara Therapeutics, and he's the interim president of the company, which started out with $1 billion from Foresight and from Arch to apply AI to the development of therapeutics.
Excellent. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you later this week for our special edition of the podcast previewing the BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit focused on Asia's arc of innovation. That is March 3rd to 5th in Singapore. Still time to book your tickets, and we have a handful of presenting company slots left. Reach out to me if you're interested. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.